All right. So, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'll be introducing our guest speaker in just a moment, but before I do, I've got some quick instructions for everyone. This session is completely bilingual in English and Spanish. We have a live interpreter on the line. Everyone will need to choose either the Spanish or English channel to hear the audio. To choose a channel, look for the little image of a globe and the word interpretation on the bottom right side of your Zoom screen. Click that and choose Spanish or English. If you choose the Spanish channel, you will hear the interpreter speaking in Spanish. You will also be able to hear the English language presenters at a low volume in the background. Presenters, this is for you. Please be sure to speak slowly and clearly and take some breaks while you're talking. That will make our interpreter's job much easier. For everyone, we have a lot of participants in this webinar, so we'll keep everyone on mute to preserve audio quality. And to ask the presenter, our guest presenter, LaToya, who I will introduce in a moment, questions during the presentation, just type your question into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Finally, this session is being recorded and the video will be available later today in both English and Spanish. We'll send you an email when all the recorded sessions are available. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our interpreter, Angie, to read these instructions in Spanish.
Hola, muy buenos días a todos, espero que se encuentren muy bien. Estamos ofreciendo servicios de interpretación el día de hoy, así que si ustedes prefieren escuchar en español, por favor vayan al símbolo redondo de un mundo que aparece en su computador y luego presionen español. Si están utilizando un teléfono o una tableta, esta opción está ubicada abajo, a mano derecha, van a ver 3 puntitos. Presionan los 3 puntitos, luego se van a Language Interpretation o interpretación de idioma, luego escogen su idioma de español y es muy importante presionar un botón que dice Done o finalizar para que puedan empezar a escuchar la interpretación. También les recordamos que esta función no funciona, digamos, en Chromebooks, así que por favor procuren no utilizar un Chromebook, sino más bien un teléfono inteligente o un computador regular para poder aprovechar la interpretación. Cualquier problema que tengan con este servicio nos dejan saber en el chat y que tengan una gran reunión. Okay, I've got an media announcements. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Angie. So good morning, everyone. Again, we're excited to bring you a guest speaker today and a training. And this training is going to be about how to get your message into the media. And we really don't have a legislative update today since the legislative session won't begin until May 18th. But once that happens, Tiffany Gladney will bring you the latest from the state legislature each week. In the meantime, we're doing some skills building to help you all with your advocacy and communication skills. So our guest today is LaToya Evans, and LaToya is a strategic communications executive who has served as a senior crisis communications strategist and spokesperson for some of the world's most notable brands, including Walmart, Bank of America, IBM, Philips, and Compass Group. She owns the LEPR agency, the national public relations firm where she leads media and marketing initiatives for high-profile businesses, politicians, and professional athletes. Notably, in 2017, LaToya served as Chief Communications Officer to then Charlotte NC Mayor Pro Tem Vi Lyles, serving as a spokesperson and chief writer for her mayoral campaign, which resulted in Lyles being elected as the city's first African-American woman mayor. LaToya holds a Master of Arts in Organizational Leadership with a concentration in crisis communications from Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Mass Communication from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also a graduate of E. Smith High School. It's Fayetteville, I believe, where the LaToya Evans Academic Excellence Scholarship has been given in her honor annually since 2004. Let me just say there is no scholarship given in my honor from my high school. We were fortunate at NC Child to get to work with LaToya and her agency last year and wanted to share some of her expertise with all of you. We're so lucky to have her here today. So please get your questions ready, and LaToya, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. As I've mentioned to Fawn, you guys, please bear with me. I am having a North Carolina allergy moment. which we are all, I'm sure, familiar with on some level. So if you see my eyes watering, it's not because I'm just that happy to be here. I am, but it's really my allergy. So I just want to preface that. But again, very, very excited to be here. I had the opportunity to work with Fawn for goodness, almost 2 years. My firm, which you'll learn a little bit more about, was very proud to work with NC Child on different initiatives between Fawn and I, and then the rest of my team. We spent a lot of time chasing a lot of legislative sessions and just honestly the passion behind the work. We worked together a lot, especially during COVID, where there was real opportunity to really try to lead the conversation. And we did that in a lot of different ways. So very proud of that work. And as mentioned, today we're going to talk about delivering your message to the media. So I'm going to jump right in. So defining what public relations is, believe it or not, this is one of the main things that I do in my job, is explain to people what we do and what we don't do. So this is the professional maintenance of a favorable public image of a company or other organization or a famous person. And then there's also the relationship between the public and the client and other organization or famous person. So PR is two-pronged. It's maintaining a professional image, but it's also being able to gauge your relationship with the public as well. The thing about my agency is we're very results driven. So to give a little background, just as was stated earlier, some of the work we've done really stems off of my experience in corporate America. I spent almost 12 years in corporate America as a PR leader for a number of companies, including Bank of America, IBM, Walmart Corporate, Compass Group, and several others before branching out and creating my own company. And it was really brought out of a need. As mentioned earlier, Mayor Vilaus was our true first client in this version of the company. And that was in 2017. And since then, we've had the opportunity to represent organizations like Twitter, Fifth Third Bank, U.S. presidential candidates, Mike Bloomberg, Joe Biden, also Andrew Yang. We work with Coca-Cola Bottling Company. We're perhaps most well known for our work with the family of George Floyd. For 2 years, we represent that family. We've also worked with Ancestry.com, the U.S. Census, the Charlotte Hornets, and a variety of others. Also well known, some of our clients include the former Miss USA Chesley Kress, Pastor John Gray, and a number of NFL, NBA, and PGA athletes. But we have a very wide function, and I think that what's great about that is we don't specialize in a specific area per se, other than crisis management. We do a lot of proactive and fun PR, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. But the main thing here is that I always say, and we'll talk about this when we get later in the presentation, a good story always gets told. There are always PR firms that people say, oh, do you do specific nonprofit work? Nonprofits are a major part of our organization. We have someone who just does community engagement and making sure that all of our clients have relationships with their local organizations. And then in turn, we also work with those nonprofits as well throughout North Carolina and throughout the US. So that's something to think about as well with us. This is our team. We call this the Leaper Core team. We also have a brand team. And we, in addition to the brand team, actually have a social media team as well. Our capabilities. So this is a little bit about what PR firms do, specifically Leaper, to give you a little bit of an idea of why we're having this discussion today about messaging. Of course, we do the good stuff, the PR. We do social media, brand and reputation management, community relations and corporate social responsibility, crisis communication, and we also serve as an advertiser as well. So this is where you guys come in. Let's talk a little bit about how we can help you with your media message. So I'm sure that everyone knows what a media or press release is. If not, feel free to drop in the chat, but I'm going to explain it here as well. So a press release is probably the number one thing that you're very familiar with when it comes to getting your message out. So I'm sure that many of you write your own press releases internally. And it's really an official statement delivered to members of the news media for the purpose of providing information, creating an official statement, or making an announcement directed for public release. Those press releases are also considering a primary source, meaning they're the original informants of the information. A lot of people love to confuse a media release with a creative writing sample. That it is not. Over to your right, I have here the newsworthy info, how press releases are written, which is what we're taught in journalism school as the reverse pyramid. So your main information tends to be in the beginning of the release. There's also a template that we use to try to explain this if you choose to write your own releases. But essentially, when you first start out in a press release, you want to get right to the nugget. What exactly are you explaining? What is most important? What do people want to take away? In your title, you have the main headline, and then we call that the head. And then a subtitle, which is called the deck, which is usually written in italics, which is an additional explainer. So in that first paragraph, you kind of want to get to what, who, what, when, where, how, why. You want to get that settled within that first 2 to 3 paragraphs. With that being said, usually your actual second paragraph is a bit of an explainer. Usually the second paragraph of a press release goes and gives a quote to a leader or notable person within the organization that can actually be the expert. That person is also typically the spokesperson for that release. So if you get any interest in media, that's also the person who tends to take those interviews. After that quote, you want to instantly go ahead and give other explaining information. Like for instance, if you say an event is May 6th at noon, you want to talk a little bit about what's going to happen at that event, usually by that third paragraph. You want to know more about it. Any validating statistics typically would go there, or paragraph 3 or 4. And then by the time you get to the bottom, background info, you start to kind of trail away at other things that are less important than the beginning of the release. You should also cap any release you have what's called a boilerplate. You've definitely seen this, guys, on press releases that have gone out, or press releases that you've gotten with partner, but it's the about section that's at the end. And that's standard of any press release. So it's usually your explainer of who you are. Usually it's the same information as an about us on a website. Who sends the press release? Typically, your PR agency or your in-house public relations or marketing will send it out. But here we're going to talk about how to be scrappy and how you can work around that. And pretty much any organization can put out a press release. And it goes to members of the media, but these days it can also go to bloggers, podcasters, and other similar media adjacent persons. So a lot of times back in the day, not to age myself, but I remember when blogs were new. We did not consider those people to be members of the media, but now blogs and other outlets like that really actually have the ability to move things forward. So we include them just as we do with media. A media advisory. This is something that's a little bit different than a press release. The purpose of a media advisory is used to invite reporters to an event to cover. So a press release, form a rally. So typically if you send this out, it's a few days before you want people to come to an event. You want press to come. And what's different about a media advisory versus a press release, if I put out a press release, it usually says for immediate release at the beginning. That means that media can take it and they can run with it. That means they can post on their websites, they can report on it today. However, with the media advisory, in the top, it typically says media advisory or for advisement, which means that you've advised media that this is happening. That means that it's not something that's going to go out to press. That means that if you have an event and you send out a media advisory versus a press release, you're going to get reporters to show up versus reporter to talk about it before it happens. Essentially, this is an invitation for the media to actually come and cover the event, essentially in retrospect. It also looks a little bit different than a press release because at the top, it'll have that one paragraph typically that's a bit of an explainer, and then it actually breaks itself out into the very easy, like who, what, when, where. They give specific media instructions on what time they should show up, what time they can set up, the who is who they will be interviewing on site, what kind of interviews are guaranteed that they can do, whether that's in a, a media gaggle situation or a one-on-one. And this is also sent, just as before, by PR firms, event planners, and also any other organizations. And this goes to members of the media and also influencers, anyone that you want to come to the event and actually create content around what happened while it was going on versus getting the public to show up. Now, the media pitch. This is something that you guys probably do consistently and don't have a name for it. The media pitch is essentially a short email, and typically back in golden years when I started doing this, it was a phone call. You could call people at their desk, but now people are not at desks. A lot of people are consistently home. So this is an email that basically can just send information and say, hey, I would be interested in covering this, or we have an announcement that's coming up, or we want to have a conversation with you. And then it's not uncommon for you to drop a press release or a draft press release if you get the reporter to agree that they won't send it out or won't use the information before a scheduled time. That's called an embargo. So a media pitch allows you to see directly to who you want to cover a specific story versus just a mass media send, which is how press releases and media advisories get out. You can send a media pitch to pretty much anyone. Well, you can say anyone can send it. What's interesting about that is a lot of the general public inadvertently pitch press all the time. You see on websites and TV where they say, call us with a news tip. That's exactly what it is. It's a pitch, essentially, just not a pitch done by a professional. So people pitch things to news outlets every day, whether they know it's called that or not. And it goes to members of the media, including the producers and editors who can influence media coverage. So you're probably asking and wondering, who does these things go to? Like, who actually would get the press release? How do I get it out to people who matter? And this is where you go about creating your media list. And I am very passionate about this because when I first started, when I got to North Carolina, background, I'm originally from North Carolina, spent about 10 years in New York and also some time in Arkansas, and came back to North Carolina. And in my jobs, I had always done pretty much national and international media. So I had not done a lot of local media. So when I got to Charlotte in particular and started building relationships and started building a list, I didn't really know anybody locally. People just assumed that I did because I did PR. So I started building my media list from scratch. So as many people know, when it comes to PR agencies, we have large databases that we pull lists. We pull all sorts of data on reporters. We can tell you when they last wrote. We can tell you pretty much anything about a reporter in these databases. But before I had that, I had to compile it normally and naturally. And there are a few tips to that. So the number one thing you should know is that most news outlets use the same email formula for all employees. So, whether that's first name, last name, at station name. So typically if you get a media inquiry from someone, that same email formula could work for another reporter that you're interested in pitching to. Now, the only thing that would change that is depending upon the time in the organization. Sometimes organizations, I think we all know this, will go and change an email formula over time just because of servers, or there may be someone with a duplicate name or a very similar name, and to keep from confusion, they may decide to change that formula. So in that case, it will be slightly different, but you will know this because you will get a bounce back. But the other thing that you should include is not just that. Go to the websites of the news outlets that you're trying to participate with, that you're trying to engage with. And they're also going to have their general newsroom. And typically one of the big secrets to getting people out to your event is after you send a media advisory 2 days before an event 2 or 3 days before an event. You also send a follow-up email that morning of the same media advisory, reminding people to get there. And you want to do these sorts of things early because most newsrooms have their editorial meetings by about 9 a.m. So at this firm at Leaper, we love to get those releases out by 8:30 because the ship has sailed there. The next time a crew will have another editorial meeting is typically in the afternoon. So when you call the newsroom, because those numbers are also on the website, that's how you go and ask. You can actually ask for a certain reporter's email. If you don't have it, that's the reporter that you're really interested in, or that assignment desk will give you their general email and they're forwarded to them. So as you do this over and over and over again, start a catalog, save the list, and next thing you know, you'll have a media list. And that's exactly how I created my own before I had access to databases. And I have you know that I've probably only had access to databases when we purchased our own because it's very expensive, I would say within the last 3 or 4 years. So to be able to build success by just doing it the hard way, it can work for you too. So you also want to include those reporters that you work with first and then slowly expand. If you want to use this, and this is my preference when it comes to like sending out media information versus the wire is for historical record. So a lot of people spend $1,000, $1,500 per press release for it to cross the wire. But the thing is, a lot of media outlets no longer use wire services for their news tips. They use the pitches, or they, organically pick an idea, or they receive a press release or information in their inbox. So we do a lot of direct sending of press releases, which means that we go and we take the press releases and we BCC everyone on them or send them individually. So those reporters are getting direct to them based off of their coverage, what they would actually get on a wire, but the information's all there and they can pursue a story that way. You can also customize that list by subject, which I suggest as you save an Excel or whatever like record keeping you want to choose that you write about in there, what exactly they actually cover. Like for instance, when we pull media lists off the databases, we take meteorologists out, for instance, because they literally can do nothing with anything that we have. We do not cover weather. So one thing that I learned definitely, especially throughout North Carolina, is how to just have some reporter conversations. I know a lot of organizations here, really honestly, love to overtalk with reporters. And this is a very dangerous thing to do, whether they seem friendly or not. Reporters aren't your friends unless they were your friends before. So there are some guidelines that you really kind of need to keep top of mind when you have reporter conversations. Always have someone else on the phone with you. So this is called staffing. So at my agency, no client goes to a media interview alone. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that number one, you want to make sure the information is delivered accurately. So whatever happens on the call, if it's just a reporter and yourself, there's no real balance check when the quote comes out to really know if that's something that you said. So that's one reason. The other reason is any additional follow-up or assets that are needed. So a lot of the spokespeople that we work with our clients, they are the CEOs or the executive directors. They're the big fish in the organization. They're the program leaders. So typically they don't have time to go back and forth with a reporter over a study that they referenced in the interview, or over a photo, or a specific statistic. So in turn, your PR firm or your marketing person or your internal media person can do that follow-up and make sure that the story is complete, because without that follow-up and those assets, a lot of times the stories won't run, because reporters tend to interview more than one person in your same field if you can get it. So it's always really a competition on who takes that quote in that space in a story over you. And they will often not tell you that they've spoken to someone with a competing organization or any other competitor, because they're trying to get the narrative right, and they're trying to get the quote that they want and information that they want that makes the most sense for the angle that they're trying to cover. We also have a tool called briefing documents. So essentially this is talking points. So for any client that has an interview that's scheduled a bit more over 24 hours, we like to prepare these briefing documents just so that those talking points are in front of you. And this is a trick that I learned even back in Walmart, and being a spokesperson for all these companies. I do it a little bit less now, but definitely more so in the still, medium part of my career. Talking points were always in front of me. So if I had a computer and I was on a phone, I was having a conversation with a reporter, I would have the points and I would integrate them into the conversation naturally. So I would say things like, well, this day is, they say is 23%. I think that's interesting because, so being able to add those transitions so that it doesn't sound like you're reading off a statement, but that you actually are engaging in a conversation, is just more educated and your notes are right there in front of you. And generally people do not know. For the same reason, you can also record the conversation if necessary. This is something that will allow you to just have the conversation, replay it back, but just remember, if you do record a conversation and the reporter has the same obligation as well, you must let them know that you're recording the conversation and ask them if they can be recorded legally. Another thing that has happened in reporter conversations, just if you try to do PR on your own, is knowing the rules of off the record and on the record. So a lot of people, I think everybody pretty much knows, oh, I told them on the record, I told them off the record. There's one general rule that you need to know. When you say, hey, can we talk off the record? They have to say yes before you divulge the off the record information. Without that confirmation, anything you say is actually on the record. And even still, journalists are under no obligation other than ethically to uphold that. So anything that you still say on background or off the record, you need to be prepared to see it again. When people say on background, it's very similar to off the record, but at the same time, it's more of an explainer. Like for instance, there are often things where we get complaints for certain clients who are service provider or product providers, and their conversation, a reporter and usually an ombudsman, which is someone who is responsible for troubleshooting. So you call these, like, many of you probably remember troubleshooter Julian from WTVD 20-something years ago, but that's called a media ombudsman. And their job is to liaise with the public and engage the media if people are not being done right in their consumer work. So typically on background for those sorts of stories, you have to explain that I can't necessarily tell you something because that information may be proprietary, it may be confidential. We run into this all the time at Bank of America, and I'm sure you guys do, with your work. You can't tell the, specific information all the time about a child in a program. You can't explain certain things about employees, especially if you get a call about an employee or someone being fired. You cannot legally say, oh, this person's been terminated necessarily, or they've been reprimanded. That's not always appropriate. But an on-background conversation allows you to divulge within reason and legally what you can say to help a reporter understand something that they may not be privy to. So that's literally background information that you're sharing to say, no, that's not accurate. That's just not true. And I always say, keep conversations to a minimum. And I know Fawn will laugh at this because Fawn, being the sweetheart that she is, will sometimes go and have an hour-long conversation with a reporter about something she's extremely passionate about. But you always kind of want to keep these things to a minimum. And that's just because you want to, A, remember definitely what you said, and B, you want to stay on message. You don't want to give a comment about something that necessarily isn't, the work that you're trying to do. And you can be slipped up very easily when you get into a groove of a long conversation, and then you find that a story comes out and the intent of the conversation is not what's in the story. And typically, even though we schedule, and I'm sure Vicki Cruz knows this, and so does Michelle Hughes, we typically schedule interviews for 30 minutes, but the reality is that a good reporter who understands what they're talking about and is just looking for that soundbite and that context, they'll be able to get you done in about 15 minutes. On average, that's how long media interviews are. for print and even for television. For television, you may have a little bit longer. It may feel longer just because a reporter has to set up a camera. They have to set up lights. They need to get themselves together. But typically, you won't be asked questions longer than 15 minutes unless you're just in a unique situation. So that's the overview of some of the media messaging conversation. So now I guess I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, LaToya. Really appreciate a lot of that wonderful information that you shared. I have a question for you, but I want to open it up and allow others to ask their questions.
Some people in the chat as well, so you let me know. Yes.
Let's start with any questions that appeared in the chat. And let's see, Fawn, do you see any of those?
Sure, I can pull some of those out. Vicky asked a really great question based on actual experience. How do you set that time boundary with reporters? So Vicky recently had this experience of reporter was really trying to do research and wound up having an hour-long kind of research background conversation. Is there a way to set that boundary with a reporter about how long you're going to talk to them?
For sure. And this is something that, Fawn, I don't know if you know that this was, just something that a regular PR practice does. So typically on your calendar invite, if you're working with a firm, they will send you a calendar invite with the timing on it. Now, on top of that, they also send the reporter one as well with the same time on it. So if the conversation is 15 minutes, if the conversation is 30 minutes, that's the boundary. And that's also the beauty of, even if you're not working with an agency, bringing someone else to the call to say, okay, well, we've got to run to be able to end that. And that's the primary goal really of that PR person on that call, not just making sure the checks and balances is okay, but also making sure that no off limits questions are asked and that if there is any follow-up that's needed, but also as the timekeeper. So you need someone there to set that boundary. And I think that someone said, how do you set that boundary with reporters? I've been asked to join. Yeah, that is Vicky's question. An hour-long interview for background research. Have that reporter send specific questions if it's research. But if you want, context or a professional opinion on that research, please reach back out for scheduling for an interview. But send any research questions to us. We can send you studies, but it's not necessarily her job to be, the study expert. It's her job to be a leader and to help publicize and push forward NC Child. Does that answer the question, Vicky?
Yes, thank you so much, LaToya. That was really helpful.
Yeah. And Vicky, I'm sure you remember the way we would hustle reporters off the phone at the 30-minute mark.
Yes.
Claire had a question about, can you talk about what makes something news from the point of view of a reporter?
Now, this is really something that has to do with what they cover. There are things that we think are news that aren't news. And typically it's something that is a development, something that's recent, not something that's in the past. When you discuss things that are in the past for a news angle, you really are trying to insert your voice in a conversation as an expert. That's the difference. Now, if you're trying to lead news, a lot of times you have to create news. Is there a study? Do you have some data? Are you announcing a new initiative? But it's typically what's fresh and new that is out there, or a response to something legislatively that has happened. But it has to be something that's current. Very rarely is it something in the past.
There's a question in here from Christy, and Christy, I might call you out to clarify your question a little bit if you feel like it. But Christy's question is around slowing or changing the questions that a reporter is asking you about your issue so that you can kind of get your point across better.
Right. So this is what we call in media training, what questions do you have for my answers? So it's like, if you have a specific, those talking points, you continue to steer that reporter back to that conversation. And there are some people who do it a little bit too aggressively, but especially if they're asking something that's just kind of off, You can just say, well, today I'm here to discuss this. I'm prepared to discuss this. We can perhaps schedule a follow-up conversation to discuss X, Y, and Z, or we can perhaps have someone else, jump on eventually to have that. I'm not the expert in the area. That's another thing that you can say. There are a lot of transitions to get you out of bad questions, and I would definitely say use them. You'll find your groove and what works for you to deflect, and to pivot is what we call it. We used to call it pivot before COVID made that word dead. We definitely, it's called a pivot, and it's called deflection, and you can do it in a professional way. But it's by keeping that interview on track with exactly what you want to talk about and what information that you have to share. Do not go down the rabbit hole of trying to answer questions you don't know the answers to. It's completely fine to say, I don't know that. May I get back to you on that? I'm not sure. Again, I'm not the expert in that area, but if you send me that question or allow me to write it down, maybe someone else around here can help you. So there's a way to do it in a way that disarms that reporter so they don't become aggressive. It reminds me of a recent situation that we had with one of our clients in Mississippi. They recently passed equal pay. We were on a call with Forbes, and the reporter had a gap between understanding something about the bill and, in general, her story clearly required a quote. A new client who had not gone through, more combative media training yet, this was one of her first interviews at the firm, did not tone down that conversation, and it ended up being a combative argument. So it's okay to say, I don't necessarily know the answer to that question, or I'm not the right person. I authored the bill or didn't author the bill, so I don't exactly know. So you should definitely have that humility there, just to kind of back away too. I hope that answered the question.
It was great. LaToya, can you talk about the role of Twitter in pitching to journalists or keeping up relationships with the reporters that cover your issues?
For sure. So as you know, Twitter is a client. So we do DEI communications for Twitter.
I didn't even think about that. Sorry, I was thinking about it as a tool.
I have to say that as I say that. I'm obligated to say that. So all that to be said is it's always age old. Now, I'll be honest. I never got into that group. I'm not a Twitter person, as awkward as that is to say. I'm a Facebook, Instagram person. If you go to my Twitter, well, fine, you did see my Twitter this morning. It's the least active of my social media because you guys have heard me now for 40 minutes. I can't speak in 140 characters. I don't know how. It's never happened. It's probably not going to happen. I'm too set in my ways now. So I say all that to say is that what was really good for people who do use Twitter is being able to engage with journalists. So I would definitely say starting that early in terms before you need them. It's always best to start a relationship before you need it. So being able to just piggyback off of those different reporters, retweet their tweets, give them, likes, comment on their stuff, and begin to cultivate that relationship. And then of course, they'll eventually follow you and there'll be a DM conversation. And of course, you can always email. You could go and find this email, whether through, the website of their news outlet or through the formula, and figure out how to get in touch with them and say that you follow them on Twitter. Most reporters like that. In fact, you will find that if you mispitch a reporter the wrong thing and they say, I don't cover this, they are so appreciative of you getting a pitch right for something that they do cover. People get extremely offended by this because they feel like you haven't done your research. And if you haven't done your research, then you're wasting their time.
I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. Adam, you said you had another question too.
Yeah, thanks so much, LaToya. My question is just regarding providing information or being a resource to reporters on background. I feel like there's a lot of times there's issues we're advocating for that we may want to bring to light a particular circumstance around that issue, but the organization, the nonprofit, may not want to be the group that's quoted in a story, et cetera. Do you have some idea or thoughts around, communicating in that way with the media?
Sure. And this is just simple as, sending an email and say, hey, can I have an off the record conversation with you, or a conversation on background with you concerning, this bill or this thing or this discussion. I have some interesting context and resources for you. I know that you've been following this, you've been writing some things, or I read your story and I think that it's missing a perspective. This is the job that I do. I'm privy to X, Y, and Z. I'd like to have that conversation with you off the record just to inform some of your stories. Do you have 10, 15 minutes where we can do that? Maybe in the future, I can give you some on the record things, because you should also consider a lot of people, a lot of reporters, once they get something good, they will push you to put that information on the record if they're ethical. Otherwise, they'll just take it and use it, which is least likely, but they may still do it. So they're going to want you to validate something on the record eventually. And I think that that's just, a mutually beneficial relationship. That's how you start a long-term relationship with a reporter. It has to be mutually beneficial because you're taking time out of their day. And it's important, you probably have heard me say that a few times now, but newsrooms aren't what they used to be. They aren't what they used to be. People in major news outlets, like major papers like Gannett, furloughed employees. During COVID, I don't know if you guys remember or had this engagement, but reporters were working half weeks. So you could be working on a story and your Monday through Wednesday reporter was one person, your Thursday through Saturday reporter is another person, but they're doing the same job. So these newsrooms are short-staffed. They're getting fired every day. There are furloughs, there are layoffs. So you have to be able to bring something mutually beneficial, or at least beneficial to them, if you're going to have a conversation off the record. But they need stuff on the record because guess what? The story is on the record. So be mindful of that when you do that. It's like, say, also offering to them, hey, I eventually can do more.
Thank you.
There's a great question in the chat from Lisa around strategies for, when we are connecting reporters with people who are really impacted by the issues, your parents or childcare providers or other folks who are like living these issues, like you were talking about, equal pay, people who are not getting paid fairly, whatever, like strategies for really helping a reporter treat those people as the experts that they are, not that kind of, sometimes it can be kind of transactional or making people look more like victims than experts. I think that's what Lisa might be trying to get to. Hopefully I said that right, Lisa.
But this happens to a lot of people. I've seen stories of notable people trying to be a resource and it goes wrong. This is why I cannot underscore enough. If you put a reporter on the phone with someone who is experiencing, hardship or things like that, someone else should go to the call to manage that and make it as easy and nice as possible. You do not just give their number, their email to someone and say, go crazy. You have to be able to treat people with dignity and respect. And that's part of that, is being a part of that conversation as well. If you can make it a joint interview, do that. You do that and add that perspective, because what you also don't want is to say something that's disparaging about people in a specific demographic that offends them. And you also don't want them to say something negative about your agency or the work that you've done as well. Not that they would, but it also, again, creates that understanding of what was said so that you have an idea of what's in that story and that you're really protecting your organization by attending that call or bringing someone else who can.
That's great. Thanks so much, LaToya. This has been incredibly helpful. I know that we're getting close to the end of time. I don't see any other questions in the chat right now. So Adam, I think we can probably hand it back to you.
All right. Thanks. And thanks so much, LaToya.
Yes,
Wonderful.
thank you. And I'm so sorry about my allergies and my little breaks I've been taking to blow my nose, but I've enjoyed this a lot. So feel free to reach out. The website's here. I'm very easy to find, as I love to say. Would be very much happy to, have a conversation with any of you about what you're trying to accomplish, but this was fun for me as well. So thank you for having me. It means a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah. Take care. Have a good weekend.
All right. You got
Yeah. All right. So everyone, that is the end of our training, our presentation for today. Again, this is going to be recorded and shared with everyone probably later this afternoon. Before we part ways for the day, though, I just wanted to ask, are there any last announcements that anyone would like to make? Okay, hearing none, then we will close the call. Thank you all so much for joining us. Yes, we have another communications training coming up on May 20th, and next Friday, if I'm not mistaken, is going to be the legislative preview by Tiffany Gladney, our policy director. So please tune in to that next week as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend. Take care.